Sometimes when things get slow, we have certain things we talk about, and from time to time, another thrilling edition of Adventures in Radioland. This segment, Hasty Decisions 2, subtitled The German Tank Transmitter. From time to time on our Qso-Vlog net, we discuss the downside of hasty decisions. Now, I don't want to minimize the obvious upside to hasty decisions, but the downside can be far more interesting. Hence, let's move along with the tale of the German tank transmitter. It was a hot afternoon in West Palm Beach, Florida. I was a young man, about 20 or so, working in my unair-conditioned shop. The Friday Florida heat was such that the sweat was pouring from my body, and took off my shirt to try and cool down as I wrestled with this 30-pound boat anchor thing on my workbench. It was an old German tank transmitter that I had purchased for $25 at a local Army-Navy surplus store. Well, it obviously came from Rommel and his German Desert Tank Corps, or so I assumed by the amount of dust and sand that covered it. At least that's what I imagined it to be. The Germans lost that war in the desert, perhaps just because of this radio. This was a low-band VHF radio with a frequency range of 20 to 50 megahertz. And sometimes propagation distances, known better as skip, can be outstanding at those frequencies. Too much so for Rommel and his boys in the desert, because their tank transmissions were being copied loud and clear on the other side of the world in Washington, D.C., much to Rommel's chagrin. Well, it had been modified somewhere, and it was now running, it had been running on 12 to 24 volts, but now it was running on 110 volts. It had been modified somewhere. And there was no output as I keyed the menu and the mic, and all the info on the radio was printed in German, so it was not very helpful. But I could almost swear this was Rommel's personal command tank radio. I could almost feel and see his fingerprints in the dust and grime on this radio. But alas, it could not transmit a word, and I wondered why. I had removed the outside cover plates, exposing many beautifully laced cable runs, all covered with a protective aged orange heavy-duty wax. Most of the wiring appeared to be color-coded, but it was still very hard to follow the wiring in the laced bundle, so what to do? I have to open up those laced bundles to get a better look. So I took a pair of small manicure scissors and began cutting the cable lace. It was tough going. The lace was very tight, and the wax was doing all it could to keep the bundle together. Well, I'll just have to try a little harder to get this scissor blade into the bundle, so I can cut the lace away to be able to trace the wiring out. So here I am with my thumb and finger through the holes of this small pair of chrome scissors. I had moved over the transmitter to get a better angle. My sweaty chest was laying on the frame, and suddenly everything went red. My body was vibrating violently. I had cut into the high voltage line. When I came to, I was still standing, but now turned away from the transmitter. And why was my body still vibrating? And something else was wrong. I wasn't breathing. Apparently, it had been a perfect storm. My chest on the radio and my fingers through the scissor holes. Meanwhile, back to the not breathing part. I could think about breathing, but that was it. I couldn't breathe. My lungs were paralyzed from the shock. I also knew I had a limited time in that condition before I would pass out, maybe permanently. Then I began pounding myself in the chest with my fist, trying to restore my paralyzed lungs, and then slowly, ever so slowly, I could take little gulps of air. About an hour later, I could breathe. A little, but it hurt. A week later, I had recovered. Now, looking back in retrospect, my hasty decision was to start cutting into that cable bundle without first unplugging the radio and then shorting out the high voltage line. The good side, I had escaped death, barely. Later, much later, I dug a hole and buried that German transmitter, never for it to threaten anyone else's life. This has been another thrilling edition of Adventures in Radioland. Well, there you go. One of my younger capers was a young man that I sometimes sooner forget than not, but I thought it might be important for some of you folks out there to exercise caution, not make hasty decisions when you're working on gear. It could cost you very dearly. Well, anyway, this is the Friday afternoon Qso-Vlog net. If you have a radio you want to check out, give me a shout.